Friday, June 14th, 2024, a thrill ride at Portland's Oaks Amusement Park froze midair.
They just said the park is closed. Jesus Christ.
Atmosphere, the giant swinging pendulum, was completing its 360-degree loop when it stopped dead at the very top. 28 people on board were left hanging completely upside down about 50 feet in the air. At first, they thought it was a glitch that would fix itself in a few seconds, but those seconds dragged on.
A minute passed and I was like, this might be more serious than I may have deduced.
Blood rushed to their heads as pressure built behind their eyes. And before they knew it, the strain on their bodies grew unbearable. Some people tried to hold their heads up to relieve the weight of their skulls pulling on their necks. However, many couldn't even budge.
Fucking terrifying. Jesus Christ, I hope those people are okay.
The tension on their stomach forced a few riders to vomit while still hanging that fell straight down towards the ground and the people below. According to witness logs, some riders later described losing feeling in their lower bodies, while others blacked out.
Gravity was pulling me down, but the seat was keeping me in, so everything was pressuring me against like the harness that was coming over me. So I can still feel soreness in my arms and my hips from that.
The ride that was supposed to last only a couple of minutes just became a 25 to 30 minute test of how long the human body could hang upside down and stay conscious. Portland fire and rescue trucks arrived within minutes, and when they stood at the base of the tower to inspect, the problem core issue became clearer. The normal motors and computer controls weren't moving the ride anymore. So there was no button anyone could press to gently swing the gondola back down. Thankfully, the safety restraints were still doing their job as nobody was falling out. But in that state, every second was still pushing them closer to potential severe complications. Thus, the only way to get those 28 people down was to physically force the tower to move. The ride instruction manual shows that there was indeed a built-in manual lowering system. However, there was a catch. The levers on hand weren't long enough to give the staff enough force to turn the ride from that locked position. So firefighters brought over a 5-foot steel rescue bar, slotted it into place, and used it like a giant crowbar to slowly muscle the tower out of vertical. Finally, there was a fragment of hope. As seats began shifting a few degrees, when people on the ground pushed on a metal bar together. Still, they needed to move carefully so the ride didn't suddenly jerk, shocking the riders' bodies even more. Little by little, the pendulum arm turned. The seats passed through upright for the first time in nearly half an hour, and the gondola finally swung back down to the loading platform. After roughly 25 to 30 minutes of hanging upside down, all 28 riders were back on the ground, shaky, sore, and trying to process what had just happened. Because of the delay in their being rescued, riders later reported ongoing headaches, nightmares, and a new fear of heights, leading to at least 6 separate lawsuits in a year. Oaks Park in turn sued Zamperla, arguing the manufacturer should be held responsible for the breakdown and the legal mess that followed. Strangely, the manufacturer, after inspecting the ride, cleared it of mechanical failures. The only issue was the lack of an automated lowering system to avoid the arduous and time-consuming manual method. On July 30th, 2025, at Green Mountain Park in Saudi Arabia, a giant pendulum ride snapped in half. One moment, the 360 big pendulum was swinging high under neon lights. The next, its main metal arm broke with a sharp crack. The arm split just below the upper pivot assembly where the gusset meets the core beam. The entire structure folded inward and crashed onto the pavement, sending dust and metal fragments flying at the people around. Families rushed in before rescue teams could arrive, clawing through wreckage with their bare hands. Park workers immediately shouted for security and first aid as they tried to push the crowd back to create space. Harnesses that had been there to keep the riders safe now held them in place against the force of the crash, so some riders were hanging sideways, others upside down with their legs tangled with the seats in front of them. The broken arm of the ride hung at an angle like a giant cracked bone. Pieces of the frame were twisted and unstable, and the rescuers had to work around sharp metal edges while they climbed over the wreckage to reach strapped-in riders. They began cutting harnesses, supporting necks and backs, and lifting people out one by one onto stretchers. Down in Taif, hospitals declared a code yellow, a special warning that a big accident had just sent a wave of injured people their way. Ambulances cycled back and forth between the park and the city, carrying people with broken bones, head injuries, and the kind of internal damage you only see in movies. Official reports confirmed 23 injuries, out of which 3 were highly critical. The most heartbreaking, however, was the death of young Wada binti Aziz Al Fahmy, who succumbed to her wounds after transfer to Riyadh. Ironically, the structure's fall angle spared more lives than it claimed. When the arm snapped, it dropped nearly straight down, and the impact followed the steel's strongest axis, absorbing energy through its frame. If the ride had tilted or rolled during the fall, its weakest wells would have taken the full hit. Seats with people could have been crushed, causing far worse injuries or deaths. But the real disaster lies in the negligence that led to the ride snapping in the first place. To understand the full picture, here is a simple map of how this ride worked. Imagine a giant metal clock arm with a spinning disc full of seats at the end. Every time it swung up, that central arm took the full weight of the riders plus the force of their movement. And the region's hot days and cold nights also introduce a slow process that can harden and crack metal over time. So regular maintenance is non-negotiable. However, incident reports state that only a few weeks before the fall, the maintenance staff had noticed a hairline fracture at the main pivot joint, where the massive steel arm that swung the gondola was attached. Yet, since they were running behind schedule, the issue was logged only as observation only, rather than schedule for repair. Not only that, but it turns out much of the ride's manufacturing work was outsourced to untrained workers just to cut costs, and there was no outside oversight to keep things in check. Eventually, every shortcut added up until one final swing carried all those mistakes and snapped midair. By the time these reports surfaced, the Green Mountain Resort was closed indefinitely with no reports on its opening. On July 26, 2017, on the opening night of the Ohio State Fair in Columbus, a row of seats suddenly tore off the Fireball ride mid-swing. A giant red and yellow pendulum was at full speed over the midway when, with a hard metallic crack, the arm jerked and one gondola separated from the ride, dropping roughly 40 to 60 feet toward the concrete below. Phone cameras that had been filming "look how high this goes" were now capturing a tangle of twisted seats and debris spraying across the fairground. Several riders were flung out and slammed into the pavement. Others stayed strapped in, pinned at strange angles in the wreckage. A section of the ride that was supposed to cradle people like a swinging bench had become a metal projectile. Within moments, the Fireball was surrounded by a ring of shocked people. Some were crying and yelling names, trying to figure out who had been on the last ride. Columbus Fire and EMS crews were already stationed at the fair, so they reached immediately upon call. Paramedics pushed through the crowd with stretchers while fair staff tried to force everyone else back. Under the ride, they found riders on the ground in different states, some awake and crying out, others still in the broken seats, strapped in by harnesses. Firefighters and medics worked side by side to cut people free, stabilize necks and backs, and get the most critical patients onto stretchers for the rush to nearby hospitals. Rides were stopped, gates were closed, and the area around the broken pendulum was taped off as an accident scene. That ended the real-time chaos, but it raised a bigger question. How does a ride that passed multiple safety checks break apart? The Fireball was about 18 years old, a traveling KMG afterburner pendulum that spent its life being taken apart, hauled on trucks, and bolted back together at fairs around the country. Structurally, 6 hollow steel beams stuck out from the main hub, like spokes on a wheel, each one carrying a row of seats. Inside one of those beams, water and debris had slowly collected over the years, rusting the metal from the inside out like a hollow bone rotting in the middle. From the outside, the beam still looks solid. Inspectors checked the ride 3 to 4 times before opening day and signed off under Ohio's rules at the time. which focused on visible cracks and wells that they could actually see. On July 26, under a normal high-G swing, it simply wasn't strong enough anymore. So it fractured, and the gondola it was holding sheared away. Later, a New Jersey jury heard evidence that KMG had been aware of this kind of internal corrosion risk in these hollow beams as early as 2012, years before the Ohio incident, and still hadn't warned owners with the same urgency. That night, 18-year-old Tyler Jarrell, who had just enlisted in the US Marine Corps days earlier, was thrown from the torn-off gondola and pronounced dead at the scene. 7 other people were rushed to hospitals with serious injuries, broken bones, crushed pelvises, spinal damage, and severe head trauma. One of them, 18-year-old Jennifer Lambert, never returned home. She lived in long-term care with a brain injury and died in 2018 from liver failure. Under the law as it existed in 2017, Ohio's investigation didn't fine or criminally charge the ride operator or state inspectors. On paper, they had followed the rules they were given, but years later, a $78 million verdict against KMG would confirm that this wasn't just a random break in a funfair ride. It was a preventable failure built up over years of trapped water, weak design, and soft laws. On July 17, 2010, at the Tibidabo amusement park in Barcelona, a 40-meter pendulum ride suddenly tipped. El Pendulo's arm was just at the beginning of its return swing when there was a violent metallic snap at the base. The entire tower tilted, dragging the gondola carrying 4 teenagers with it and crashing onto the lower level of the park. The arm and cabin dropped sideways off their concrete footing, slamming into another attraction below in a cloud of dust and twisted steel. Since the riders were strapped in, they didn't tumble out during the fall, but were thrown and crushed inside the gondola as it hit. People nearby ducked and scrambled out as the staff shouted for everyone to get back. Up close, the gondola had turned into a cage of bent steel and cracked plastic with 4 young passengers trapped inside. Some were badly hurt but conscious, others lay in their restraints, pinned by the twisted frame around them. Park workers reacted fast. They hit emergency stops, cut power, and pushed bystanders away from the wreckage to clear space for an ambulance zone in the narrow terraces. Calls went out to emergency services, and within minutes, police and medical teams arrived on site. Paramedics and firefighters had to work in an awkward, dangerous space, on a slope amid broken steel and loose parts. They squeezed between beams to reach the 4 teens inside, stabilized necks and spines where they could, and began cutting and prying the seats open to free the riders. The victims were rushed to hospitals, while police sealed off the area and evacuated the rest of the park. But how did a steel ride that's only been open for 4 years suddenly rip out of the ground? Well, El Pendulo's entire tower had been held to its concrete foundation by a ring of thick steel anchor bolts like giant screws sticking up from the base. And every day, the swings of the ride pulled and pushed at those bolts with thousands of kilos of force over and over again. In fact, about 3 hours before the disaster, riders and staff had noticed strange noises and unusual movement at the bottom of the ride. Upon noticing, the park followed its protocol. They emptied the gondola, ran a test cycle without passengers, and because it didn't fail at that time, they reopened it. When engineers later rebuilt the event on paper, they concluded that several of those foundation bolts were already badly cracked before that afternoon. And under the load of another swing, a group of them broke almost together, the base lost its grip on the concrete, and the whole column had nothing left to hold it upright. Among the 4 miners who had been on that ride, a 15-year-old girl died from her injuries, while the other 3 were injured, with at least 2 in serious condition in the days that followed. In the end, in 2015, a Spanish court convicted 10 technicians involved in the design, fabrication, installation, and maintenance of the ride of negligent homicide and injury. Most of them were sentenced for up to 2 years, while others were suspended, and El Pendulo was permanently closed and removed. On October 25, 2016, at Dreamworld Park in Australia, a family water ride faced an unexpected hurdle. 6 people in a round orange raft named Thunder River Rapids Ride were almost at the end of the belt near the unloading platform when they noticed something ahead. An empty raft stranded at the top of the belt. Before anyone could react, the occupied raft slammed into the back of the stuck raft. The impact shoved it forward and up, while the front of the occupied raft lifted, causing it to be pushed back towards a large open gap in the middle of the conveyor, where several wooden slats were missing. People nearby heard the first heavy bang as plastic hit metal, then a deeper grinding as the conveyor belt kept dragging both rafts upward. From the side of the channel, it looked unreal. One raft jammed crooked at the top, and the second raft being forced up into it at a steep, unnatural angle. Among the 6 people in the occupied raft were 4 adults and 2 children, still strapped into their seats as the floor under them tilted. The collision had already thrown them forward into the center ring, and as the belt kept pulling, the rear of their raft dropped further into the open gap where several slats were missing. Despite the collision, the conveyor didn't stop. The belt kept feeding the jammed rafts into the steel frame. Meanwhile, at the control panel, alarms lit up as one of the operators hit the main stop button over and over, expecting the conveyor to freeze. But since it was never built for emergencies, the system took several seconds to slow down. The empty raft in front bounced and settled back onto its rails, but the occupied raft tipped even steeper, its back end being pulled deeper and deeper into that gap. Suddenly, the belt stopped, and the adults managed to push 2 kids onto a nearby structure, out of harm's way. However, it was too late for the adults. Within seconds, all 4 were pulled into the tangle of metal, rubber, and moving parts under and beside the raft, where the forces were far beyond anything a human body can take. People on the viewing platform ran toward the unload area, calling out to them while staff shouted for everyone to move back from the channel. Staff triggered emergency procedures and called 000, Australia's emergency number, while pulling the kids to safety. Their parents and relatives were still trapped in the wreckage. Within minutes, paramedics, police, and firefighters arrived at Dreamworld's gates and headed straight to the Rapids Rise. On site, they found the rafts jammed up at the top of the lift hill, plastic twisted, and bodies caught among the slats and steel. They cut power, secured the area so nothing else would move, and tried to reach anyone who might still be alive. But how did one of the most common rides in Australia fail so unrealistically? That's when we found a major red flag in the ride's interior. On the surface, Thunder River Rapids looked simple. Round 6-seat rafts floated along a man-made river. Under the surface, the system depended on 2 pumps keeping the water level high enough for the rafts to glide smoothly. And on the afternoon of the accident, 1 pump failed. Water levels near the conveyor dropped, and an empty raft grounded on the metal rails at the top instead of floating neatly into the unload zone. And that did activate an alarm, causing the conveyor to be stopped, but the raft simply conducted an unofficial reset and restart routine, thus sending the next raft full of guests up the belt towards an obstacle that no one had cleared. On top of that, years earlier, many of the wooden slats on that conveyor had been removed, leaving a large gap in the middle, big enough for the back of a raft to fall into, if it was pushed the wrong way. Over the ride's 30-year life, there had been near misses. An earlier raft collision, and a 2014 incident where a boat partially rode up into the conveyor frame. But despite those incidents, no one filled the gap, and there was never a full engineer-led risk assessment of the design. So by the time the rescuers reached the riders, the 4 adults, Kate, her brother Luke, his partner Ruzbehi, and fellow mother Cindy were all dead. A long coronial inquest later found that Thunder River Rapids had been completely unsafe for its entire life, and that Dreamworld's safety systems were frighteningly unsophisticated, rejecting the idea that this was a freak accident and calling it the result of a systemic failure. Dreamworld's owner, Arden Leisure, eventually pleaded guilty to 3 breaches of workplace health and safety law and was fined 3.6 million Australian dollars. But no individual went to prison. In the end, the ride was demolished. On August 7th, 2016, at Schlitterbahn Water Park, a 3-person raft on the world's tallest water slide flew off. Verrückt's raft flew over the top of its hill and lifted off the fiberglass. It slammed into the netting and the metal support hoops holding it up, hard enough that a 10-year-old boy and the 2 women beside him were thrown into the mesh with brutal force. The raft came down the rest of the slide crooked, leaking water and blood, and drilled into the splash pool at the bottom like something from a crash site. Since Verrückt sat high over the rest of the park, people all over Schlitterbahn could see the slide and the raft at the bottom. Phones that had been filming the huge drop a minute earlier were lowered or shut off as the reality set in. Consequently, Verrückt's pumps were shut off, the conveyor stopped feeding new rafts up the tower, and the base of the slide turned from an attraction exit into the center of an emergency scene. Paramedics, police, and firefighters arrived within minutes and found the raft sitting in shallow water, and the victims were being helped out. But how could a water slide allow a raft to go that high in the first place? Now, Verrückt wasn't a normal slide. It towered about 168 feet and 7 inches above the ground, taller than Niagara Falls, with a near vertical first drop that could send rafts towards 70 miles an hour, then an uphill second hill and another drop before the final pool. 3 riders sat in line on an inflatable raft held in by Velcro seatbelts and handles, and attendants at the top were supposed to check that their combined weight sat between roughly 400 and 550 pounds, so the raft wouldn't be too light or too heavy. On paper, that weight range was meant to keep every run inside a safe speed window, but the basic shape of the ride created a hidden problem. At high enough speeds, hitting that second hill was like hitting a jump in a car. Instead of staying pressed to the surface, the raft could lift. According to legal findings, early test runs before Verrückt opened had already seen rafts go airborne off that second hill. Yet, instead of redesigning, the park tried to solve the problem by stringing a safety net over the slide hung from a series of metal hoops that arched directly above the raft's path. Now, although those nets were made to keep people from flying off, those rings were a threat of their own if the rafts jumped too high. So in the 2 seasons before the accident, Verrückt collected a record of injuries that didn't match the smiling TV clips. Riders reported neck and back wounds, concussions, but Kansas law at the time let parks rely on their own inspectors and made it easy for incidents to be underreported or treated as minor. However, despite the stack of reports, Verrückt passed its annual inspections, and by August 2016, the cost of this negligence was paid by the 10-year-old Caleb Schwab, whose head hit the upper hoop with fatal force. The 2 women riding with him survived, but suffered severe facial injuries, broken bones, and long-term psychological trauma. Behind the scenes, the legal fallout was messy. Civil lawsuits brought by Caleb's family and other victims led to settlements reportedly totaling around $20 million from Schlitterbahn and several companies involved. Verrückt itself never reopened after that day. The enormous slide was torn down in 2018, and the park itself was later closed and sold off. If unsettling disasters are something you enjoy, you would love our video about